In the United Kingdom today, a silent crisis is unfolding, a crisis that many don't see unless they are living it. According to the Department for Work and Pensions, or the DWP, over 1.6 million children across the UK are now officially impacted by the controversial two-child limit placed on universal credit. That's not a typo. 1.6 million children in one of the wealthiest nations on earth. And while policymakers defend this policy as a means of promoting fairness or fiscal responsibility for hundreds of thousands of families, the consequences are real, raw, and devastating. Behind each statistic is a child going without essentials, a parent forced to make impossible choices, and a household plunged deeper into financial distress, all because of a rule that, to many, feels less like policy and more like punishment. As of April, data reveals that a staggering 1,665,540 children in the UK are now living in households affected by the two-child benefit cap. That figure represents a 2% increase from just the year before. That's over 37,000 additional children impacted in the span of just 12 months. And the numbers continue to rise. According to the DWP's own statistics, 469,780 households claiming universal credit have had their support restricted under this rule. These families, often already living on the margins, denied vital financial support for any child born after April 2017 if they already have two children. Imagine being a mother of three in a low-income household. The eldest two children receive some support from the state. But your youngest, born in 2018, does not. Not because their needs are any different. Not because their hunger is less real. But because of the year they were born, and the number they hold in the birth order. Let that sink in. The DWP policy, introduced under austerity-driven reforms, denies child tax credit or universal credit support for third and subsequent children born after that April 2017 cutoff. And the impact is becoming impossible to ignore. Nearly 500,000 homes, precisely 453,600, missed out on the child element of universal credit for at least one of their children. That's a staggering amount of missing support in households that are most vulnerable, most financially stretched, and most in need of compassion. Critics of the policy are growing louder and more urgent. Peter Tutton, the Director of Policy, Research and Public Affairs at Step Change Debt Charity, painted a sobering picture. He warns that families with dependent children are already at higher risk of falling into problem debt and financial hardship. And now, thanks to this cap, that vulnerability is magnified. He explains that parents with more than two children are overrepresented among those seeking debt advice. In other words, families affected by the two-child cap are not just struggling, they are sinking. They are more likely to fall behind on rent, to default on council tax, or to borrow money just to put food on the table. The link between this policy and rising poverty levels is impossible to deny. According to Step Change, poverty among families with more than two children has surged since this cap was introduced. Every new year under this rule adds thousands more families to that list. Tutton doesn't mince words. He calls on the government to end this policy as part of its upcoming child poverty strategy. And he's not alone. Countless advocacy groups, MPs, and charities have echoed his call for reform. He urges that the time for tinkering around the edges is over. What is needed, he says, is a more compassionate social security system. One that doesn't punish families for growing. One that recognizes that children are not just numbers in a budget spreadsheet but human beings with dreams, potential, and basic needs. The two-child limit has long been a source of political tension. Introduced in 2017 under the guise of encouraging responsibility and reducing welfare dependency, the policy was always controversial. But now, in a time of skyrocketing rent, energy bills, and food costs, it's become something more, a symbol of a broken safety net. And while critics rage against the cruelty of the rule, the government continues to defend it. A spokesperson for the government responded by saying they are determined to give all children the best possible start in life. But critics question how that claim can be squared with a policy that deliberately denies support to some children purely based on their birth order. The government points to its so-called Plan for Change, a reform program that aims to overhaul the welfare system, promote employment, and build a stronger economy. They argue that getting parents into work is the best way to improve outcomes for children. That's why they're investing in free school meals, expanding early education, and launching family hubs to offer localized support. And in fairness, these investments are important. But they don't address the central issue. No amount of policy gloss or pilot schemes can distract from the cold, hard truth that under current law, tens of thousands of British children are being categorically excluded from support, not because of anything they've done, but because of the year they were born and because they are the third child in a loving family. As the data mounts and the stories of hardship grow louder, the political stakes are rising. The Labour government has so far not indicated a plan to reverse the two-child limit. Many expected change when Labour came into power, but so far, the silence has been deafening. Campaigners are calling on Sir Keir Starmer and his ministers to break that silence and to act. Because while Westminster debates reforms, the consequences are being felt in real time. In cities and towns across the UK, parents are skipping meals to feed their children. They are working multiple jobs and still falling short. They are forced to explain to their youngest why there isn't enough money for school trips, for uniforms, or sometimes, even for dinner. And for what? A policy that may save the Treasury money on paper but costs society so much more in dignity, opportunity, and childhood well-being. The message from campaigners like Peter Tutton is clear: this is a moral issue, not just a financial one. If we are to call ourselves a civilized society, then no child should be treated as less deserving based on when they were born. Every child matters. Every child deserves a fair start. The question now is whether our leaders agree. Will this government finally listen? Will they end the cap, or will they allow another year of growing hardship, rising child poverty, and despair among the nation's poorest families? Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about benefits. It's about what kind of society we want to be. A society that lifts families up, or one that tells the poorest children they simply don't count. This is not just a crisis of numbers. This is a crisis of values. Because when you look at those DWP statistics not as dry figures on a spreadsheet, but as real families, with real lives, the weight of this policy becomes even more chilling. Let's take a moment to visualize what this policy actually looks like on the ground. It looks like a single mother of 3 in Birmingham, working 30 hours a week on minimum wage, watching every penny while still not being able to afford a proper coat for her youngest when winter arrives. It looks like a family in Leeds forced to decide between paying their electric bill or buying enough food for all 4 kids that week. It looks like children growing up with the burden of financial strain already stacked against them before they even begin school. What kind of message does that send? Because if you're the third child in a low-income household born after 2017, the system has already decided that you're worth less support. That your basic needs don't merit the same attention. That somehow, your existence creates an extra financial burden not on your parents, but on the state. That's the uncomfortable implication of this cap. And that's what campaigners are fighting to overturn. Step Change and other charities are ringing the alarm bell with increasing urgency. They say this policy directly contributes to the worsening child poverty crisis in Britain. And remember, poverty isn't just about going without. It's about lost potential. It's about children falling behind at school because they are too hungry to concentrate. It's about mental health issues forming early in life because of stress at home. It's about the psychological toll of growing up in a world that tells you you're invisible. The government claims to care. It insists it's delivering for families. But how can that be true while 1 million children are being sidelined from basic support? And it's not just the present that's at stake. The long-term effects of childhood poverty are well documented. Children growing up in financially insecure households are more likely to face poor educational outcomes, poor health, and limited employment opportunities later in life. They are more likely to remain trapped in cycles of deprivation. And each generation that falls through the cracks is a tragedy not just for them, but for society as a whole. This is why so many are calling for immediate change. And here's something else worth considering: this isn't even a policy that applies equally across the board. Exceptions exist. Certain situations such as multiple births, adoption, or if the child was conceived through rape are exempt from the cap. But those exemptions are rare and often difficult to claim. In fact, the requirement for women to prove rape in order to access support for a child has been widely condemned by human rights groups and MPs across party lines. It's one of the most criticized aspects of the entire universal credit system. We'll be following this story closely as the pressure mounts for change. For now, if your household has been impacted by the 2-child limit, or if you're one of the 469,000 families feeling the effects of this policy, you're not alone. And your voice matters. Stay with